Thank you, Mr. Asario Angelo. All right. As a chairman, I guess I get to ask the questions first. Yay. I still remember when the pandemic started off. And how many of you had this family experience where you pick up the phone and it's your wife? And your wife is going, you know, I'm here handling all these unemployment requests at the surgery center she ran. And a lot of it were people who had never worked there, people who hadn't worked there in years. But the best one was when she was getting unemployment requests or the verifications for herself. And the phone call was, do you want me to quit now? Because apparently I'm already asking for the unemployment. And, okay, a small surgery center, I think they may have had 20, 30 employees. And she said they added up over that year, hundreds of these came in. I have a board here, and this is sort of going on the theme, and forgive me, I'm going to do something a little awkward, but I don't have a better way to do this. We're trying to not only, and this is going to go to you substantially, Ms. Miller, because you've actually touched on things that everyone else also touched on. We were trying to get our heads around, if we had a national data exchange for the verification, as our friend from New Jersey just spoke about, does it stop it where the identities, the identities are out there, they've been stolen. We've actually, as members of Congress, had our identities stolen not too long ago. Does it stop it where the actual applying? Where in this process, because we've been tracking some crazy stories of UI fraud that was converted to gift cards, that got moved into buying cars, and then the cars were shipped to North Africa as a way to wash the money. Let's say we had your data exchange. Where do I break the fraud loop? The information, the ability to make the requests.
Yeah, well, thank you. The data is the way to address this significant problem, which is identity theft that you're talking about. And we saw unprecedented identity theft because of the vast number of data breaches that we've experienced. Every single American's information is available for sale on the dark web today. You can buy Social Security numbers for about 25 cents a piece now. They've gone down. They were about $1 a piece about a year ago. And so as a result of having so much information available for so little money, and fraud actors being able to monetize that information, what agencies need at the federal and the state level is the ability to identify quickly those indicators that would suggest that somebody who's applying for a benefit is in fact a stolen identity. Things like the device geolocation. So in the UI fraud, for example, if somebody was applying for pandemic benefits and they lived in Nigeria and you were sitting in the UI office in Iowa, you did not have any kind of IP address tracking to know that.
But Ms. Miller, can I bust that by using a VPN?
Yes. And you can, most of these tools to effectively use stolen identities can be circumvented, especially in the age of generative AI. So now we've even got much more sophisticated tools than we did at the beginning of the pandemic that they're using and exploiting right now. And so as a result, as Amy mentioned, the concept of, a dynamic and a static. We've got a dynamic adversary and we have very, very static processes that address them. Agencies need to be able to use the kinds of tools that banks use, that technology companies use, that, where they can very quickly identify these patterns, and that is a data problem. And we have a data problem in government. We are very protective of the privacy of citizen data, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be, but in today, when every single one of our identities are being stolen on the dark web, but the government is protecting our information to the degree that the adversaries can use the data, but the government can't use it to stop them.
Okay, and I have a handful of questions, but I want to finish one last with Ms. Miller. In your testimony, what do I have to change statutorily or redefine statutorily so I don't run into the constant excuse that we often as members of Congress, well, that has a privacy concern or that's over there. At the same time, these people's privacy has long since been violated.
You know, honestly, I'm for privacy. I believe in privacy. But the privacy, there's a very, very robust protection of privacy sort of lobby and group on one side who's gone so far, and we need to consider that we live in a different world now. The Privacy Act and the Computer Matching Act were written at a time that we are in, this environment that we're living in is changing monthly. Literally, it's changing every month. And we've got laws that we haven't changed in years. So the Privacy Act, the Computer Matching Act, and the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the FCRA, all three of those need to be considered on the basis of how we can better use data to prevent fraud across the government.
Okay.
Chairman Schweiker, back to your original question on that chart. I don't want to hurt Mr. Patrick with bringing it up again, but this is where I think we need to marry technology and policy. Because on that chart you had the stolen identities, then the applying for unemployment, and then getting the benefits. Right now, under statute, we have to let everybody apply for UI benefits, no matter if we know that they're stolen in advance. The way the current statute is that we have to let everybody apply,
okay,
then do the security check.
Say that sentence afterwards. Again. So even when it hits your door, you still have to.
We have to process that application. Now, clearly, the identity verification and all the other checks can be part of that process afterwards. But we can't deny anybody the ability to apply for unemployment benefits at this time.
Okay, Ms. Shea, and this is one off, but for my own sanity, I need to ask: have you seen any research done on how many bad actors around the world this fraud may have helped finance? Because think about what's going on in the Middle East right now, and we've had some things come to our office saying some of these organized international criminal cartels were washing the money for violence. Any place I can go to chase that down?
Well, so no specific numbers and amounts, but we did look at some of that information through the Department of Justice press releases on cases. And so we have some information about foreign actors exploiting the various pandemic programs in different programs, not just unemployment insurance. But I do want to get back to this issue of addressing unemployment insurance fraud issues. In 2020, there is an integrity data hub that provides services to states to check the verification, whether or not there's an application across states. If somebody applies in multiple states, the bank account verification, it will do a validation of the bank account. It will check to see whether there are identity flags on a particular application. In 2020, 34 states participated in that integrity data hub, and the other states did not.
For the 34, how effective was it?
Well, notwithstanding some of the issues Rob mentioned about prohibitions against certain checks, it provides information to the states about where there are flags, where there are areas of concern where the payment should not be made. Now, Department of Labor has since been able to get all 50 states and 3 territories signed up for that service. It's a free service. It's available to them. So I think as we're thinking about resources and additional data sources and new technologies that can be applied, it's also important to think about what's already available to federally funded programs and to federal programs to prevent fraud.
Okay, my very last question. Could I take that data hub and enhance it with Ms. Miller's AI and other database touches? Is there a way that this isn't reinventing the wheel, but making the wheel much more efficient? And now I forced the two of you to talk to each other.
Yeah, that's what really needs to get done. I mean, if we want to fix this, we have to think about the states working together. And so there is this hub that does have, it provides an opportunity for them to share data across the states. If they augment that with third-party data, they're going to have a whole lot more robust data sets to be able to share information and identify fraud schemes much quicker and more effectively.
Okay, thank you, witnesses. It's actually appreciated. Ms. Pasquill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Miller, we can't legislate directly identity theft. That's my contention. So we need to work from the front end and put into legislation reasonable and unreasonable sometimes, as you pointed out. We're in a different world. But basically reasonable attempts to prevent the fraud or the possibilities of fraud from ever happening. That's not only true here, unemployment insurance. We talked about it yesterday. Every federal program. I've never met anybody on this panel, this committee, on either side. Now, no one's privy to virtue in politics. Let's get that straight. But we can't be helpless to the problem. Only it's going to get worse. The chairman's pointed that out vividly. But everybody on this panel doesn't simply send their support for legislation because, so what? Somebody gets it that doesn't deserve it, so what? No, no, that undermines the credibility of the program. You know that better than I do. So we need to take a very close look at this, and it is a serious, serious problem dealing with serious, serious money. Mr. Commissioner, the title of this hearing is Keeping History from Repeating Itself. What are the top things we here can do to keep this criminal activity, this is criminal, what we're talking about here, from happening again? Because there's going to be programs in the future that are ripe for those who wish to deceive. And those who wish to deceive are taking money from their peers who are getting the advantage of the programs. So I don't want to hear generally about the poor. The poor are many times crooks. Really? Are you serious? So what do you think we can do about it?
Well, hopefully we never have to have a situation like COVID ever again. But if one does arise, some kind of national emergency, don't ever pass a program like PUA again. PUA was primarily for independent contractors and self-employed. It should have been in Treasury or SBA. 1099 workers, the self-employed, are inherently small businesses. PUA was the main cause of UI fraud during COVID and sort of got the camel's nose under the tent, as they say. In regular UI, the employers or the workers are the crucial part of the anti-fraud process. It comes back where you talked about your wife working at the Third Center. That is how we stop fraud very often. We hear from the employers who say, hey, I got a filing for this person. We know, one, they don't exist, or two, they don't work for us, or three, they are still employed. That's one of our most important ways to fight fraud.
The specifics that you are talking about, would you please, at your leisure, put them down in very specific order in terms of the being parallel to what you testified today, and get it to everybody on this panel? I'd ask you to do that. Is that asking too much? Not
at all, Congressman. To answer Congressman Stryker's question before, he does know everybody in New Jersey, yes.
Thank you. Every Democratic member on this panel worked very closely with the President to include $2 billion, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, for unemployment insurance fraud-fighting measures in the landmark, the American Rescue Plan. Not that long ago. Can you provide some examples of how New Jersey spent these federal dollars to modernize its UI program in support of workers to prevent fraud?
There's a lot. I'll try to keep it really brief. We've increased fraud staff, specifically the creation of our cyber fraud investigations unit. We contract with an identity credentialing vendor. Now we have a dark web monitoring service. We procured IT services to enhance an existing data analytical tool, which allowed us to ingest numerous data elements, like Ms. Miller talked about, to identify fraud trends and patterns. We supported our pilot, along with Arkansas from USDOL, our claimant experience pilot, which informed much of our current research and best practices on our new application, which will launch in just a couple weeks. We established our Office of Unemployment Modernization to deliver a UI system built with smaller modular pieces, not one big chunk all at one time that usually leads to failure, and all other forms of our UI modernization, which is always going to make our systems more secure.
Mr. Pasquale, are you telling me I have things to learn from New Jersey?
Yes.
We're going to go to 2-1 on this just because we're running into some interesting conference time. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Chairman Schweikert, for holding the hearing. My first question is for Ms. Miller. In December of 2022, the Secret Service announced that hackers linked to the Chinese government stole at least $20 million in U.S. COVID relief benefits, including UI funds, in over a dozen states. A former assistant U.S. attorney who indicted these hackers from this Chinese criminal group in both 2019 and 2020 said that the hackers have, quote, tens of thousands of machines, quote, end quote, going at one time to obtain personally identifiable information and generate criminal profits. Even more concerning, officials and experts told one media outlet that other federal investigations of pandemic fraud seem to point back to foreign state-affiliated hackers. So my question, Ms. Miller, American officials have blamed Chinese hackers for the breaches of OPM, of Anthem Health, and Equifax. And it's clear that COVID fraud is not just a domestic issue, this is a matter of national security. So based on your experience working with the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, which is a member of course, of DOJ's International Organized Crime Intelligence and Operations Center, what are the national security implications, in your view, of foreign state-affiliated hackers stealing taxpayer funds that were intended to be for COVID relief benefit programs?
Yeah, data on this is still being evaluated, but there's some estimates that half of the pandemic unemployment assistance fraud went to adversarial nations. And that's pretty problematic when you consider that people, when they think about fraud, they think, oh, it's just a little rounding error, it's a problem. This was fraud that's funding our adversaries. That's what happened during the pandemic, and that's why there's so much attention on it, which is valid. These hackers, and there is a full underground market of fraud actors today. We call it fraud as a service, and it is those fraud actors, they have at their disposal really sophisticated artificial intelligence tools. They have the flexibility and agility to be able to move. If something's not working, they can just take something down and put it back up. We've seen where the DOJ has taken down a malware site, and it's been back up 2 months later, and it's even more effective. So we cannot fight this adversary the way that we are currently fighting this adversary, because this adversary is serious, and they're looking to steal money to create not just a financial problem, but a national security problem.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Ms. Shea, what are the existing tools that agencies can be using to prevent money that is fraudulently claimed from going out the door?
So GAO is dedicated to helping agencies enhance their strategic approach to fraud risk. You know, we're always going to come back to what it is that the program managers can do. And, you know, you're hearing a lot about the risk involved, and so trying to encourage them to better understand that risk so that they can strategically plan for it, identify what the best solutions are. And we do that through things like our fraud risk framework, which lays out 38 leading practices, a roadmap for agencies to understand how best to strategically manage risk. We've developed an anti-fraud resource, which is a web-based, interactive, user-friendly guide that lays out the who, what, when, why, and how of, you know, how fraud happens, so that they can understand and take action. There are other tools and resources like Treasury's anti-fraud playbook, which helps agencies figure out how to best manage their risk and understand them. So in addition to a couple of matters that we have recommended to Congress to take to help address these issues.
And in your position of Director of Forensic Audits, you made recommendations to federal agencies on how to improve their fraud prevention. So number one, have the agencies agreed with those recommendations? And number two, have they implemented those recommendations?
So we have made a number of recommendations in normal operations and, of course, in the COVID programs. And I'd say about 27 overall, 28 overall related to COVID-specific fraud risk management. And there are still, I think, about 18 of those left open. So agencies do not always agree, and that's true in normal operations. We don't always get agreement, and that relates back to the mindset issue. They aren't always appreciating the risk that exists.
Thank you. Thanks to the panel for being here. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Stubbe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting shutdowns imposed tremendous costs on our nation. Unfortunately, criminals exploited our dysfunctional federal government to steal American taxpayer funds intended to alleviate the suffering. This resulted in the fraudulent transfer of over $280 billion to criminals, according to an Associated Press analysis. American taxpayers were fleeced and their government failed in its duty to protect their tax dollars. GAO has estimated the unemployment fraud during the pandemic may reach as high as $135 billion. That figure represents 15% of all unemployment insurance benefits paid out during the pandemic. Meanwhile, criminals further victimized American citizens through identity theft schemes. The Federal Trade Commission reported a 3,000% increase in identity theft claims related to government benefits in 2020. This caused difficulty in accessing benefits for many law-abiding Americans. The sad fact is that much of this could have been prevented. The federal government should be better stewards of the hard-earned dollars American families pay in taxes. Law enforcement must track down these criminals and recover the illegally obtained funds, but we also need to plan for the future to ensure this never happens again. The tools exist for the federal government to prevent this kind of fraud. We just need to make sure that the tools are actually used. Mrs. Miller, the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, where you served as the Deputy Executive Director, developed an analytics tool called the Pandemic Analytics Center of Excellence, which use analytic technology to uncover patterns, anomalies, and red flags that point to potential fraud. This tool has been used by numerous law enforcement agencies to open over 500 investigations into 6,000 subjects, representing an estimated potential fraud loss of $500 million. Can you comment on the development of the PACE tool as well as other ways that technology can be used to address fraud in the future?
Yeah, thank you. The PACE is one of the bright spots in government anti-fraud activities that's in the history of American government. The PACE has created a center of excellence, a hub. They negotiated 95 data use agreements. Honestly, that's probably the biggest accomplishment of the PACE. I can't overstate how challenging it is for agencies to share data. They actually usually just stop trying because of how hard it is to put a data use agreement in place. But because the PACE's whole focus was on trying to gather a lot of data in one place in order to use it to prevent fraud, they were able to get those 95 data use agreements in place. They also have FinCEN data, they have suspicious activity reports data, they're using a lot of third-party data, and they're using really impressive artificial intelligence tools. This should be the model going forward. But the important point I want to make, though, is that is only for investigations. We know that we recover about 50 cents on every dollar of fraud that's been stolen. And with identity theft, it's even less than that. We need a PACE inside of the management side of government so that these kinds of tools can be used prior to making a payment, which is why I have been advocating for the creation of a management side center of excellence. Where that sits is open to discussion. Treasury could be one area that you could put it in. But it needs to have the same capabilities, and it needs to have that dedicated focus because, again, the people at the PACE, that's their entire job, is negotiating data sharing agreements, acquiring data, pulling data scientists in. The other thing the PACE did was create a data science fellowship, and they were able to get recently graduated data scientists from different universities to come and work on these projects. It's very difficult to get the data science resources within the federal government, and so such an analytics center of excellence sitting on the management side should also look at that as a model in order to acquire the data science expertise that's needed.
So you're proposing the creation of a dedicated anti-fraud office for basically the entire federal government. What's preventing agencies from using these existing tools to protect against fraud instead of creating that?
So agencies, number one, most of them don't have, they will tell you, I'm not there, but they will tell you that they don't have the resources. They'll say, hey, and this gets back to this whole incentives piece. They'll say our job is to get a benefit out. That's our job. Our mission is benefit delivery. Our mission is not prevention of fraud. That's the IG's mission. And the focus, what we've been trying to do at GAO and when I was at GAO and ever since, is trying to get agencies to understand that their job is to prevent fraud. But until they don't, so they'll say they don't have the resources, they'll say that they don't have the ability to get the data, they'll tell you that the data is the problem. The problem is partly because they can't negotiate these data sharing agreements. It's partly because they think privacy laws and FCRA requirements limit them from using that data. So they'll tell you all kinds of things, but really the challenge is that they're not sitting in this hearing today. And typically we weren't having hearings about fraud until the pandemic happened. Once they sit in the hot seat, I think you'll start to see them take this more seriously.
All right, thank you. I have 7 seconds. So Ms. Simon, can you just explain quickly some cases which COVID relief benefits were stolen and subsequently used for criminal activity?
Certainly. Just one quick PS on Linda's point. When I was in the Department of Labor and we tried to get data on incarcerated individuals at the federal level during the pandemic, which, as you know, would have been very helpful, we ran straight into a brick wall of legal and financial obstacles. And so I just want to say from experience, that's an incredibly real reality. Yes, pandemic fraud is effectively a vertical for many criminal organizations, and it is an income source. And there was a recent DOJ indictment, I believe in Michigan, that was a sprawling scheme that was funded by multiple kinds of pandemic fraud, including unemployment insurance, that had murder for hire as one of its services. So these are not run-of-the-mill, someone down the street claimed a few extra weeks that they shouldn't have claimed. This is serious street crime.
Thank you for being here today. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stupi. Ms. Chu.
Yes, I'd like to start by reminding my colleagues that the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program was authorized by the CARES Act and extended by the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, both in overwhelmingly bipartisan votes. Additionally, Ways and Means Democrats secured funding to fight fraud and recover taxpayer dollars in the American Rescue Plan. The pandemic was an unprecedented disruption of our economy, and we hope that this does not happen again. But what was clear was that there was necessity for benefits, unemployment benefits, and that is why Democrats and Republicans acted together to expand unemployment benefits as quickly as possible to assist American families who, through no fault of their own, suddenly found themselves without a way to provide for their family's basic needs. This was a success, which is why the U.S. has had a stronger economic recovery than any of our peers. From my district, I've heard from many individuals that federal pandemic unemployment benefits were a lifeline for providing for basic necessities like food and life-saving medications. That includes Gretchen from Altadena, California, who has been in the film and television industry for the last 30 years and is a cancer survivor whose medical coverage is predicated on the number of hours worked. And Mary from Pasadena, California, a nursery school teacher whose employer's doors closed and had to file for unemployment for the first time in her 26-year career. And May, the primary breadwinner for her family living in Sierra Madre, trying to stay afloat, all while distance learning with her 3 kids. The swift action of Congress mitigated the hardship that jobless workers and their families suffered, and it was essential in stabilizing an economy that lost a staggering 22 million jobs in just 2 months in early 2020. We know that there are lessons to be learned from these efforts that can strengthen and sustain the UI system for future emergencies, and I hope that it's the goal of the hearing to not neglect our duties to protect our workers in the midst of a global pandemic. So, Mr. Asaro Angelo, I do want to note that Democrats took the issue of fraud seriously. As part of the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, Democrats provided the Department of Labor with $2 billion to strengthen the integrity and preparedness of state UI systems, as well as to provide grants to states for fraud detection and prevention and overpayment recovery efforts. However, earlier this year, the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023 rescinded ARPA funding for UI programs and reduced the total funding for UI programs from $2 billion to $1 billion. So in your testimony, you mentioned that New Jersey used these funds to modernize your unemployment system. Can you talk about how these modernization efforts are critical to preventing fraud, and what would be the impact on fraud mitigation by cutting these funds?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, these funds have been critical because modernization is key to fighting fraud as well. And the important part of this is that modernization doesn't end. I think it's been a real problem for our systems for far too long that a state would spend millions of dollars, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars, to go get a procurement for a new system that may or may not have included anti-fraud measures. Then years later, they'd be delivered this system that's already out of date, and any changes they want to make to that system, they need to go back and get change orders, get a new contract. I don't think I need to tell anybody here, government procurement is not fast or agile, but what we've done is use the agile method, using the GSA contract, or we're working with a team, a vendor team that is, we're working together about building this product, about building small modular parts, which was considered in ARPA, by the way. That way, not only can we be more agile by putting new programs in, we can share them with other states. And the funding that came out of the ARP for modernization specifically states that states who use these funds have to be able to share that with other states. Because right now, when you go to the vendor, they own the code for the most part. And sharing amongst states on this stuff is very difficult. So I'm really thrilled that the USDOL put that in their grant writing for the modernization. We're very proud to receive one of the $11.35 million grants. Because of that rescission, though, not every state could receive it. It became a competitive process as opposed to every state receiving those dollars. So, but it was very smart how they wrote that. Whenever dollars being used out of that, we think we'll share that product and those victories with other states as well.
Very good. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. Ms. Ten.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and your ranking member, and thank you to the witnesses. Great testimony, lots of great documents in here. I really appreciate it. And I come from New York State, which got a tremendous amount of money for unemployment insurance and a tremendous amount of fraud. And I just wanted to address this first, I think, to well, first I'll go to Ms. Miller, maybe Ms. Simon first, and Ms. Miller have you comment. The previous Department of Labor OIG report provided oversight, and the unemployment insurance program stated that some internal controls had traditionally been used or recommended to the states, but were not used. So I cite back to a recent committee hearing that we had with the Office of the Inspector General, wherein they cited the state of New York was warned back in 2010 that they did not have adequate controls in place to handle the existing unemployment insurance claims that they had. And I'll just give you a pre-pandemic, an improper payment amount was roughly about 10.34%. After the pandemic, it was almost 30%. The fraud rate of 4.5%, and this is before pandemic with poor controls in place, it went to almost 18%. The claims before the pandemic in 2019, the quarter before, there were $530 million in claims, went to, in 2021, after the first quarter of 2021, went to 6.5 billion, from 530 million to 6.5 billion, an 1,124% increase in claims because of the lack of New York State to have controls. And while my colleague wants to make this partisan, all of this information is coming from Democratic Controller Tom DiNapoli, who has provided numerous reports on warning New York on what is happening to taxpayer money. And the reason I'm so concerned about this is we have created this huge burden on our unemployment insurance trust fund, and that our small employers who were forced to lay off during the pandemic are now paying for this, as are New York State taxpayers, because the funds were squandered that came through either the American Rescue Plan or other CARES Act monies. What can we do to get New York up to speed and really being a true sound steward of taxpayer dollars that have been wasted? And you mentioned, international rings up to 50% of the monies. What can we do? What can New York do today to protect its small businesses and its taxpayers in preventing this colossal fraud that we have seen largely due to the inability of the Department of Labor in New York State to properly implement programs? What can we do, like today, in the next few months to curb the costs that we're seeing to prevent this fraud? And Ms. Simon, I think I'll address it to you first, and then maybe Ms. Miller.
Certainly. I think the one thing that specifically about this hearing and the question that you asked is that the questions I have started asking when I look at a state's posture is, are the use cases across the fraud life cycle being addressed? So, I think so. Should I?
Talk right in.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Really close. Okay, yeah. Perfect. One of the questions I ask is, if you think about the use cases across the fraud life cycle and ask hard, specific, clear questions of the New York Department of Labor, before a claimant applies, what tools do you have? What information are you getting? What are you doing with that information? As the claimant is applying, how are you verifying their identity? What do you do with high-risk identities? And then after they've applied, when you see suspicious activity, how do you handle that? What tools do you have in place? What processes? How many fraud investigators do you have? How many cases are going to prosecution? But those kinds of questions have not traditionally been asked to state departments of labor, certainly not by federal counterparts, and often folks like the state auditor are the ones asking those questions. So I'm happy to have a conversation also offline and give you specific advice, but I think one of the questions is to get very, very specific about the entire life cycle. What is the state doing? What tools does it have in place? And what is it doing with the information it gathers?
Thank you. Ms. Miller, if you could just
I would
give us a plan.
Sure. I mean, I just think one of the things is when no one else is looking. So who calls one of you guys? Someone who says they didn't get a benefit, right? Nobody really calls and says, oh my God, there's a ton of fraud in the UI program. That only happens later when the IG puts out a report and everyone gets alarmed. And so when this is done and when this blows over, they're still going to go back to worrying about getting that benefit out quickly because that's who they're going to hear from. They're going to hear from a congressperson when a constituent is saying, I'm not getting my benefit. So I'm going back to incentives to fraud prevention. Internal controls is not exciting stuff. They don't want to worry about internal controls until there's a hearing. And so we have to, Congress has to incentivize them and build this into their performance metrics. We are glad you're getting benefits out the door quickly, but we also want to make sure that you are doing things to make sure only eligible beneficiaries are getting those benefits and not just worrying about the squeaky wheel, which is, did I get my benefit and did I get it quickly?
Right, yet we keep flooding these agencies with billions of dollars in taxpayer money and we're hurting our small business community. So thank you so much for your expertise. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Those are terrific questions. Mr. Finstra.
Thank you, Chairman Schweikert and Ranking Member. Thank you very much. I want to also thank our witnesses and for all your information that you've given. To me, it's all about solutions. We've got to figure out solutions. We've got to really dig down and understand. Obviously, we know what's happening, and we have improper payments, we have fraud, we have waste, we have criminals trying to take advantage of our taxpayers. So here's my question to Ms. Miller and Mrs. Simon. We have AI. We have private companies that deal with this all the time when it comes to credit card companies. They do a great job. We have bank companies that are also doing the same thing. What can we take from them as a federal government and say, hey, let's apply this to what we are doing and to reduce this fraud? And Ms. Miller, first, how can we handle this? I mean, how can we identify the fraud with these new techniques, and then how can we apply it?
Sure. Yeah, the private sector has really, really advanced tools that they use at the front of what they call the front of the sale. So at the very beginning, right? So when someone's applying for a new benefit, if they're opening an account at a bank, or if they're looking to make a transaction, the bank can very quickly, in what they call in their words as a low friction technology, right? They can take a ton of data about me when I apply and say, this looks like Linda's. We've seen this social security number and this address associated with Linda, but we've never seen it coming from that IP address. Or, this person says that they're applying for this benefit here, but we have information that shows that that bank account is actually in an entirely different state or maybe even a different country. Right. And so they're able to take all that kind of information and triangulate it. They're also able to say, oh, this new applicant for this loan is actually affiliated with 4 other people, all of whom have been indicted for fraud. This looks like this person might be a shell company associated with a number in a fraud ring. These are the the things that the private sector can do. The government has very little, if any, ability to use that kind of data to make those determinations. And that's why the fraud actors are...
Why can't we use that data?
Well, partly it's that most agencies don't even, honestly, most of them don't even know that these are capabilities they can have. There needs to be a lot more education of agency leadership of what kinds of tools could they put in place. But again, it gets back to no one's really telling them this is an important priority. So when they get a budget, their budget is focused on getting benefits out the door. It's not focused on preventing fraud. If instead there's built in this money here, we're going to give you this $10 million, but we expect you to use $1 million of that to build in fraud prevention tools using data. Yes. And if they're told that, then they can go and find those. But right now, they're not even looking for it. And so you see things like the Inflation Reduction Act or the Infrastructure Act, where money is going out to states and local governments all across the country. There is very likely enormous fraud in those programs, and there's very little fraud prevention tools being used today.
So it's the dollars and it's the technology. And that's why I'm saying this is ripe for AI. I mean, absolutely. Yes. We have to look at the private sector and solve our problems with what they have been experts on.
Yeah, and you can use large language models like generative AI, like a ChatGPT, to, within seconds, you could take applications to a program and identify anomalies. You 100%. Can identify text that's duplicative, that indicates that someone's using the same information.
Agreed.
This could be done in seconds if agencies could adopt those technologies.
Thank you. Ms. Simon, if you could add on to this, I mean, and what are your thoughts on, I mean, I just don't see this as rocket science. It's just a matter of getting the tools to our federal government.
Absolutely. So I think two things. One, to underscore both of your points, I had a vendor call me. This was after I left government. This is a vendor that's used by most of the large banks for that front-end piece, sort of intelligence. And he said, I've been calling state workforce agencies, and I can't get people to call me back. I want to help. I want to be part of the solution. So I think on one side that is an issue. However, it would be unfair to state workforce agencies if we didn't acknowledge the administrative funding struggles that they have. There is not a dedicated line of funding for fraud. I think there should be, quite frankly.
So the cost, it's really the cost. I mean, there's not dollars to do this. Is that a fair statement?
The dollars are not prioritized to do this, or the trade-offs are extremely steep for states. And so I think thinking about the funding, that if we want fraud to be part of the mission, then the mission funding needs to involve fraud-specific funding.
Right. And I'd like to see the ROI on this. I mean, return on investment of saying, all right, if we put X amount of dollars for prevention, what do we get back in return? And not only that, you're protecting your taxpayers. So I just think this is not hard to solve, but we just, as a government, got to do it. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Pascoe would like to touch base on something you were speaking of.
I have no problem with what you just produced. I really don't. However, if you turn to what I think is a parallel example of the IRS, in terms of the debates we had over that. Again, neither side is privy to virtue. But the point is, some folks use the data that you talk about to destroy the program. And I'm very fearful of that. You may say, well, you're too fearful. But that's my thought in my mind.
And there's got to be protections for that, 100%.
Well, I hope they stand up.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, for both of you, let's have a side conversation, because I think there's a simple technology solution that actually fixes for both of your concerns. Ms. Moore.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing. And I do want to thank our panel for their patience and their extraordinary testimony, extraordinary efforts to stop fraud and abuse. I do want the chairman to know that I had my very first vanilla cappuccino.
Yay.
You know, well, I'm not going to become a latte liberal. I'm from the Midwest. We just drink plain old coffee all the time. But I do appreciate your effort. Having said that, I just want to join everyone on this panel to say we're against fraud and abuse. We're against taxpayers footing the bill. And just to look through some of this extraordinary testimony, I'm just looking, for example, with Ms. Simon, with your testimony. I mean, who knew identity theft, synthetic identity, account takeover, phishing schemes, benefit cards, skimming, bribery schemes, self-dealing, document fraud, bot attacks. I mean, not to mention places like Wisconsin where our technology for unemployment, and I think you made this point, Mr. Osaro Angelo, it was from 1970. I don't even think you have to be all that bright to figure out how to breach something like that. That being said, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, 22 million people lost their jobs due to no fault of their own. And just looking at the material here, it seems like we had a surge of like 33 million extra unemployment claims. And one of the things that I guess I want to hear from the panel is we had a hearing earlier on this committee, on the full committee on unemployment fraud, and it seemed that there was a tremendous effort going to be put into going after fraud for people who may not even have known that they got an overpayment. I mean, there might have been somebody who got an overpayment of $1,200 they didn't deserve, but we had expanded unemployment benefits. They may not have even known. And so I just want to hear from you, maybe Ms. Miller, Ms. Simon, maybe Mr. Osaro Angelo, if I'm running out of time. What were the benefits versus the losses that we had in rescuing people from poverty, making sure that some people could pay their mortgages, keep up with their bills, continue consumer spending? And what message does it send for us to expend government resources running after, you know, Joanne Smith, who got $1,500 she didn't deserve and may not have even known that she didn't deserve it? Ms. Miller.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're raising is a really, really good point about risk. And when we talk about fraud, and certainly GAO is the expert in this area, focusing on risk is really important. We're not going to get back all the dollars, and they're not all equal. When we're talking about organized crime rings and nation-state actors, that's who we need to be focusing on, not someone who got an extra $1,500. And it's really important because we don't have the resources anyways, right, to go back and try to go after that money. And we don't want to send that message that it's, you know, we're turning the United States into some sort of police state where we're trying to make sure that everybody only gets exactly what they're entitled to. That's why we want to use risk, and that's why we want to use data and technology so that we can focus those efforts on those most serious, most egregious actors that are operating rings, and we can do that using technology. And then, you know, when we have additional resources, the priorities need to be set by the agencies, but the priorities should not be on the small dollar frauds. The priority should be on the large nation-state and organized crime rings, and that's where I think all of us up here are in agreement that should be the focus.
Mr. Osaro Angelo.
Thank you for your question. First of all, as far as the overpayments, I'm proud that NASWA, which I mentioned before, which includes my counterparts across the country, voted in a unanimous and bipartisan manner to urge Congress to waive all non-fraudulent pandemic-related unemployment compensation overpayments. The amount of time and staff needed to pursue these non-fraud overpayments with a very low return absolutely undermines our efforts at fighting current and future fraud. Just real quick, I also want to mention, we keep talking about as if there's one unemployment system. There are 53 different systems. I mean, if you want to solve or have a way better handle on the fraud, combine, have more tools from the Department of Labor where all states can be talking to each other, where there's one set of applications, one set of security procedures, one set of anti-fraud measures. By these fraudsters being able to pick and choose, they couldn't be happier. And whatever we can do to be talking more, and we do a lot of this through NASWA. I'm very proud of our work on these efforts. The IDH was mentioned before. I must say, though, even though it was only 36 in 2020, it wasn't as important then because it was only regular UI. So we always had the employers as the backstop. PUA made the IDH really important. So I think whatever we do can consolidate our efforts across the states and in the federal government, we should be able to do.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Davis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for giving me the opportunity to wave on to this hearing. Although I'm not a member of the subcommittee, my state of Illinois, which is a rather large state, as a matter of fact, had tremendous challenges and problems. But I also remember the great work that the State Employment Agency did in terms of fielding questions, all the requests that came through. And so when we discovered that this kind of fraud was taking place, we were outraged, quite frankly, that criminal rings stole unemployment insurance benefits during the pandemic, which is the reason that we Democrats worked so hard to make sure that we would provide the resources to do something about it. And I can't help but recall that not a single Republican voted for these anti-fraud funds. So we also are proud of the work that we and all of you in the states did to keep workers afloat during the pandemic, which led to the fastest economic recovery in our history. Commissioner Ansari Angelo, would forgiving overpayments, and you partially answered that a moment ago, but would forgiving overpayments made to workers who were completely without fault free up resources that your state would need to improve benefit access and prevent future fraud?
There's no doubt about it. The going after overpayments, as I mentioned before, is a really low return on investment. And also need to remember that during the time of the COVID, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, FPUC, all those programs, the rules were changing literally day by day for us and for claimants. So to have a claimant and be in a position where if you apply in March, the rules are different than when you apply in December, or the guidance we're getting from USDOL, through no fault of their own, to be clear, things are changing very quickly. Our rules were different almost from week to week. So being able to be eligible one week and not eligible the next week, it was very difficult for our claimants and for our staff who are newly trained up, newly implementing programs. So certainly, as I mentioned before, we're all in favor of waiving all non-fraudulent overpayments that came from the pandemic programs.
And what happened when the pandemic hit to the number of requests for benefits in New Jersey?
Well, during the week of March, ending March 6th, we had 7,900 claims. 2 weeks later, during March 21st, we had 155,000 people applied for UI. New claims increased to 205,000 the following week. Within 5 weeks, we had 1 million claims in New Jersey.
Well, I know that you and your staff worked hard to get the benefits out as quickly as you could. What effect did this have on the workers?
Well, I would say the benefits served their purpose as laid out in statute and regulation and desire to provide workers with an income during loss of employment, and most importantly, keep them on their feet so they can look for work while still supporting themselves, their families, and their communities. The system also helps sustain our economies by sustaining the purchasing power of millions of workers, as Congressman Pascrell mentioned earlier. And so over the past few years, even with COVID, we've had a remarkable increase in the number of small businesses in New Jersey, and I think largely because of the investment that came through to help workers during this trying time.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, after your treatment of giving me the opportunity to wave on and also the refreshments that you serve, maybe I'll wave on.
I have a coffee problem, Mr. Davis. I hope everyone else will. But thank you for joining us. And forgive the tyranny of our schedule and our clock. Ms. Pasquale and I have a running agreement here as part of the discussion that in many ways this is shorter than we'd like it to be, but one of the more interesting hearings we've ever had. You did something unique as a group, all of you. You actually gave us a path where we think we can do something positive and maybe make the future more robust. Everything from things we're going to need to know how to do New Jersey meet the privacy standards and the security standards of the federal government, to the ability, could we actually take what Ms. Miller spoke about, the AI, and Ms. Simon touched on, the what is available out there, and how it changes so rapidly. And could we ever wrap that around some of the services that Ms. Shea spoke about that already exist? It is traditional, as the chairman at the end, I need to tell you that you're subject to potential written requests from members that will be made part of the permanent record. Please be prepared also for maybe more than just 2 weeks of asking for your help as staff speaks to staff of what could we do to never go through this again. And with that, this hearing is over.